Our fourth seminar here is on data binding. First off, what is data binding? It's basically once you have some kind of data object, it's associating it with a control so that that control can display it in a proper manner. We use data binding because it makes getting data on a page and usable much faster and much easier to maintain. You'll see some examples of that in a few slides ahead. Well, first, before we use a data-bound control or do data binding, we actually need data. Right now, you have the schema on the handout that shows the student database we're working with. The focus of this seminar and this presentation in particular is not on how to use a database or how to make a database. It's simply, once we have data, how do we use it? There's a picture of the schema there. And let's just look at the data we have real quick. Here's a student table. It's got a primary key in there. It's got a column for first and last name. We've got a professor's table. It also has a primary key, a first and a last name. There's a bunch of professors in there, including Professor Chaos. We've got a courses table as well that has some additional information. For the purpose of this lab, we're actually giving you a data access layer that you can use to access the information in the database. What's important about this is that the data that actually comes back is going to be typecast. It's not just string data that needs parsed out. Typically, in an application that uses a database, you could write queries in an actual string and pass that into your database to get data out for each request. The alternative is to make an entire layer between your application and the database to manage all that for you. So basically that's what we're giving you in this example. Here we can see we're creating a data access object for students, and in one line we're just selecting all of the information out of that and casting it to a student object. If you were to pause the debugger and add a watch to that variable, you can see here's some objects that came out. You can see the values for first and last name and the primary key and how that gets managed. But again, this isn't the focus. We just know that we have data now, and how do we use it? So we're starting off with a new page. We have a div on it, and it's got to run at equals server. There's not much there, but it's at least a starting point for us to jump off of. Alright, now we're messing in our page load event, and we're going to try and get data to display in that div somehow. The same code you saw from the previous slide where we're selecting out the students from the database, and we're going to try and bind that data by making some controls so that we can get that displaying on the screen. First, we're going to look at binding the hard way. So basically, we have a for each loop in here that's iterating over each student in that list. And basically, for each one, we're creating controls on the fly. We're creating some labels, some text boxes to show the data. And it's binding one for the primary key for the name and the last name. It's a little messy, but I think it'll work. And hey, we're just trying out things, so we'll see what happens. For every student, we're making a separate label for each thing we want to show, and for each property. And then we're adding this to the page. And again, the code behind file. For the actual property name, we're just making a label. And then for the value in it, we're making a text box. And it should look really cool. And oh, well, it doesn't actually look that great. It's kind of strewn about there. Well, we can try and clean it up. The literal control is something you can reference in ASP.NET. Basically, it's if you want to add HTML verbatim. Like if you want to just add in BRs from the code behind, you can make a new literal and set the inner text to BR, and that code will be inserted as is whenever it renders the actual page. So let's add some of those into our for each loop. And it's starting to look a little better. I mean, it's not super ugly, but it's not that great either. To do this in a cleaner way, and the way it might look a little nicer, we're going to try and use data binding. In the previous example, we were doing each control, each label, and text box by hand, which is okay, but it's error prone because if you make a mistake in one of those, then you're going to have a mess on your hands. It's also a little more difficult to maintain. The control we're going to try and use to show this data instead is a grid view. Obviously now our markup is no longer just a div. We've got an ASP grid view control in there. And you can see some of the attributes we've set. Basically, the little columns tag, we're defining the different fields we want to display. Data field is telling it which actual property to show, and then header text is what we want the column to say. And now in our code behind file, instead of having that giant ugly for each loop, now in our data bind the easy way, we're simply saying gridview.dataSource equals list gridview.databind. So let's see how that looks. That looks much better. It's nice and clean. Nothing's like off kilter. And we've got all our data in there. Again, the advantage to this is that literally we're able to bind all our data to that control in 2 lines. Data source and data bind. There are other ways to accomplish data binding using the eval function. Basically, this is the function you can reference in your markup to bind any UI item to some kind of data, whether it's in a collection or a property in the page. It's used for late bound data, which it basically means it's happening at runtime. We're going to show an example of this. We're actually going to be data binding with a label here. In our example page, I'm setting a property, this property called page data. I'm just putting this as a test in there, just to have something to play around with. And for label 1, I'm calling data bind on that to tell it to bind the data I'm going to set to that label. Okay. Sorry. Again, eval is used to get the value of that property and insert it into that control. Most data bound controls, like a data list or a grid view, they call this data bind function automatically. However, for controls like labels, they don't call it automatically, even though they have access to that. And we can see an example of this over here. In the text, we're calling data binder and evaluating that page data property. And that's going to, at runtime, bind whatever value is in that property to the label. Again, this is just an example of how you can use this eval function to bind data to your controls. Just a caveat here, this is from MSDN as well. Since this is using late bound evaluation, it's happening at runtime, and it can be slow compared to like normal data binding, as with like a grid view or something like that. So it's something to keep in mind.